Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 705, June the 10th, 1985. I mentioned last week Mrs. Kroc, Mrs. Joan B. Kroc, K-R-O-C, put an ad in the newspaper, a quotation of General Eisenhower, and I wanted to read the exact quotation to you this week. I skipped over it too fast for you. This speech was given April 16th, 1953. She spent $500,000 placing this in 23 newspapers. This is the direct quotation. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and who are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And speaking of cross of iron, the men that he worked with that influenced our whole nation later, such as Mr. Donovan and William Casey and Reinhard Gehlen and James Angleton, who affected our history up to the current hour, were all knighted by the Vatican, made sovereign military Order of Malta as soon as the war was over, and then came to influence turning the OSS into the CIA with the help of the Nazis, and we are hanging on their cross of iron. If you don't like it, get down, because the spear will pierce and that will be the end. But right now, we are hanging where Eisenhower said we were, and that cloud is now the actual acts that are taking place. This was a speech April 16th, 1953. Now, in the early 50s, Robert Welch began to form the John Birch Society, named after a gentleman in the OSS, John Birch. Also assisting with that cross were people who were to be knighted by the Vatican, such as Alexander Haig, the protege of Fritz Kramer, Vernon Walters, General Walters, the Buckley family, and William Buckley, forming the Young Americans for Freedom. Now, the Birch Society was going to Southeast Asia, to General Douglas MacArthur, to Charles Willoughby, actually Carl Wiedenbach, the Japanese Mafia under Mr. Sasakawa, encouraging Reverend Moon in South Korea, and Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek's family, the Asian connection to Germany, and Wiedenbach going to the German school, military school, with Mr. Wiedenmeyer, the American general that Ronald Reagan just honored recently. The cast of characters began to meld who were opposed to General Eisenhower and had selected their own person to take over from him, specifically Richard Nixon. But we're not going to that history now. I only bring it up because she's talking in her article that she has paid for Mrs. Kroc about the necessity for having a world of peace. Her name is Joan B. Kroc. She's the widow of Ray Kroc, K-R-O-C, as I said. And quoting for her is a man named Mike Sund. She quickly took a trip, I guess because of the publicity of this material in these 23 newspapers. She went off to Europe, and she had a release statement for the news. In quotes, I have been blessed with the means to put my convictions to work, and no conviction I have is greater than that nothing makes sense in our lives unless we create the basis for a decent and workable peace. We are sliding toward a total breakdown of human society because we are giving less attention to the need to protect the rights of generations to come than we are giving to our lawns or our swimming pools. Kroc feels, in quotes, that it is important for American citizens to act and speak out on this issue. She's going August the 6th to Hiroshima to mark the 40th anniversary of the nuclear attack on that city. She will join leaders of the peace movement from around the world in urging the bilateral cessation of nuclear weapon testing. I hope she goes into Star Wars with Mr. Daniel Graham, General Daniel Graham, and Fritz Kramer, and Edward Teller and that nest that are planning something equally as bad as the atomic bomb. She's printing 500,000 copies of Missile Envy, a book by Helen Caldecott, and she's going to send these around to educators and government leaders. Now, we don't all have the means. She has the means to do this, to put her convictions to work. I am always complaining because it takes a lot of money just to get out the kind of work that I do and just get this message to a few people. Imagine if we could convert that 400,000 that she put in the newspaper, or I mentioned the 12,000 that Bill Graham put in the newspaper in San Francisco objecting to the Bitburg trip of Ronald Reagan. If you combine those two, you could set up a research center that would disseminate all these files and all the books that I have here to anyone in the United States who wanted them. Those were quickly placed into newspapers, and I'm sure the effects will be great, but I wish somebody would tap a few of these multimillionaires and send them up to Via Critola on Carmel and get them off their ass, and let's see if there's some positive steps to stop these people. Eisenhower gave that speech, but the very fact that he was president of the United States for 8 years and that nobody listened to him and nothing was put into action has brought us to where we are now. To call attention to it is one thing. To get the people who are doing it is something else. I decided not to go to Washington for that celebration because there will be a lot of people there, and the time and money that it takes to get back there for just the street scene, as it were, is not as important as for me to continue what I'm doing here. So I've decided that that is a luxury. It's more expensive than getting a large amount of subscriptions that would cover me for the year that I need, and so I'm not going to take the trip back there. But for those of you that on the East Coast, I'm give you all the information about where to go, and you'll be reading about it August the 4th in Washington, D.C. And to help support this project, I've included on the sheet that goes with this broadcast the address of where you can get information of a large poster of the Ribbon Project or postcards, and there's a book that's coming out you can order, and that money will help with the massive project that is taking place. One woman, a very fine woman, Justine Merritt, got the idea for this project, and this just shows the power and the love that people can do as individuals that spreads around the world. I give her bravos. I think it's even more important than a one-page ad for $12,000 because this is a symbol of world love and world peace of all people, all kinds, not just a bomb dropping on our head, but a bringing out the best in us. And the 500 segments that they choose out of the thousands that are sent in will be put in the Peace Museum. It's going to be in Chicago, and they will be touring around the world. These fabrics will be touring around the world. So it's a large project with a lot of feeling, and you can still be a part of it for a long, long time. And if you want, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, and I'll give you all the information on the book, the poster, the meeting places, because August the 4th will come around quickly, and you should have information of where to help support the project and how to be part of it. Now on to Joseph Mengele. Michael Jackson had Simon Wiesenthal on his broadcast last week, and he was interviewing him about the possibility whether that body was Joseph Mengele. And when the interview was over, he said he finalized it by saying that was Simon Wiesenthal, the man who spearheaded the drive to find Mengele. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I just shudder when I hear these things on the air. This man is getting or wants $5 million from the California taxpayers for his institute in Los Angeles, $30 million in Washington, D.C. He didn't spearhead this story. He has blocked it. He has stopped it. And as a matter of fact, he didn't even find Eichmann, but he got all the credit. And the original finding of Adolf Eichmann wasn't Wiesenthal. It's so horrendous to live with these lies. It just makes me shudder when I think how much information has gone to those people and how they've sat on it all this time. And then we come up with this other story, and we're forced to examine it and scrutinize it for the lies that it is. The San Francisco Chronicle had a reprint of New York Times story yesterday about a woman, Gita Stammer, who said that her family housed Joseph Mengele. I'll get into the details of that in a little while or next week. But, pardon me, the important thing, there are 3 comments at the bottom of the article. This was titled, "In Other Developments." 1, the police doctor who signed the death certificate of the man who drowned, Dr. Mendonca, Mendonca, told reporters that the body was a man of 53 years of age. Mr. Gerhardt, the name that Mengele allegedly used for a while, was also 53. and Mengele at that time would have been 67. The second point they made was Menachem Russek, Menachem Russek, Russek, head of the Nazi War Crimes Unit of the National Police in Jerusalem, said, I am convinced that man Mengele is alive, and this affair is happening because of the pressure he finds himself in. This is because of the pressure Mengele is in. Where is the pressure? The pressure comes from funding the John DeLorean Motor Company with the goal was to fund it with cash from cocaine profits. The pressure is locating banks where the cocaine money that went to Barbie went to Switzerland. The pressure is finding who put the money in the banks for Joseph Mengele and who the couriers were. He doesn't specify the pressures, and it wasn't ever Wiesenthal that brought these pressures out. But he says it's the pressure to find him. Who was looking for Joseph Mengele before the John DeLorean money was missing? When did his name last come in the news? Check the chronology of what we've had on World Watchers and as the story unfolded, and you'll see where the pressure was. The third point is that Brazilian authorities have reluctantly agreed to allow the United States and West German fingerprint and handwriting experts to work in the case. However, the forensic tests on the body exhumed will be carried out exclusively by Brazilian examiners. Now, the Brazilian doctors have worked with the top Nazis since the end of World War II. The Brazilian government was put in power by our Knights of Malta, such as Vernon Walters and William Casey and William Donovan, for 21 years. William Simon, another Knight of Malta, his name has been involved with Mr. Garnero in the financial scandals, as well as the Bechtel Corporation. And John McCone, the head of Bechtel, is a Knight of Malta, that sword of iron that we're hanging on. And the government had an election, and after 21 years, they decided to have less than a military dictatorship. On the eve the president-elect is to be inaugurated, he is poisoned and then subsequently dies. The 21-year-old dictatorship is still in power, and the medical examiners are there. Now, medical examiners changed the course of history. Just to cite three: John Kennedy's assassination. Now, the reason I objected to David Lifton's book, Best Evidence on the Autopsy of John Kennedy, is that you don't change history with a scalpel. You don't have to. You change history with a fountain pen. What the medical examiner writes is what is there. And that changed the entire history of the United States. We had our coup in 1963, and Brazil had theirs in 1964. The second autopsy that was a total lie was Howard Hughes. That medical examiner lied. It was Vance Cooper. It wasn't Hughes. And if they knew that from 1971 to 1976 there was no Hughes, you would understand more about the merger this past week of General Motors with Hughes Aircraft, of Hughes Aircraft being able to put $5 billion into the Medical Institute, and I'll be doing a lot more on that in the weeks to come. One of the directors of the Hughes Medical Institute is from the DuPonts now, and DuPonts are working on AIDS, and I can make a strong case for the use of space stations and secret tests, which they're doing right now, up on the satellites on the disease AIDS, which could become a new plague to wipe out segments of our population. The takeover of the Hughes organization, selling the tool company, and now the aircraft, and putting the money into the medicine. I've warned and warned that the medical bomb is as explosive as the atomic bomb that people simultaneously should be watching. The medical bomb, the spread of disease, and the possibility of wiping out large segments of the world and changing their minds and their bodies. The autopsy of Robert Kennedy assassination, the lying about the double bullets, and John Kennedy, the triple assassins, and Robert Kennedy, the double. And where did Edgar Thane Cesar go? Where did he go after he shot Robert Kennedy from the back of the head? To Riverside, to work with the Nazis linked to the Aryan nations, to Richard Butler. They both worked at Lockheed together in Glendale, to the worldwide computers of Nazis around the world. Those three autopsies changed the course of history, and now these Brazilian examiners want to work exclusively on that particular body. But it was interesting that from Jerusalem they said this is all happening because of the pressure. Now, BONN newspaper came out just today This is June the 10th, and it says Bonn newspaper quotes the medical examiners. They assume the body is Joseph Mengele. Now, Bonn wants to end this issue once and for all. This is the Bonn government of Helmut Kohl, of Mr. Kohl's decisions to go to Bitburg, to later rest all antagonism towards the Waffen-SS, and incidentally, and as soon as I can, I'm going into the role of our former National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, and Helmut Kohl and the German government and the money that started that Georgetown Center for all the covert action and counterintelligence that's been going on with Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen. I'll be doing more on that later. But West Germany, Bonn government, they sent their examiners to Brazil last week to examine this body. The three investigators drew a conclusion after questioning an Austrian couple and so forth who had sheltered Joseph Mengele. They said, according to the facts now at hand, it is to be assumed that the corpse buried on the 8th of February 1979 under the name of Wolfgang Gerhardt is Joseph Mengele. Now, I don't know why it is to be assumed at all that that is the case. The people that housed, if they housed Mr. Mengele for a while, and I don't doubt that that wasn't one of his safe houses, the same gentleman that said that he died on that particular day was the man who was swimming when the Mr. Gerhardt substitute drowned. The 53-year-old who drowned while swimming was swimming under the name of, allegedly, of Wolfgang Gerhardt, and then supposed to be Joseph Mengele. This is all a convoluted lie. The Bonn newspaper didn't say how it had obtained the report. Die Welt, D-I-E-W-E-L-T, is the newspaper. It has close contacts with West German law enforcement and carries exclusive police work. Well, how would they get the report? They wrote the report that it was him. So they assume, as if you have to assume it. Die Welt implied that the West German authorities were upset by the way the Brazilian authorities were exhuming the body. The Germans tried and did not have any influence in the way it was exhumed. The skeleton was not salvaged complete with the casket, but single parts were taken out unsystematically, and the casket stayed in the grave. Did you see how they threw bones out? Now, when they dug up one casket in Germany to find a certain Nazi, Mr. Mueller, who was supposed to be dead, they opened up the casket and there were 3 bodies in there. But here they're taking parts of a body, and you don't know if there's somebody else's bones in there too or what. They just threw him in a box and went. Asked by the investigators why they didn't report him, they asked the Bossarts who hid this burial for all this time. They said not for ideological reasons, but that they were humanitarians, that it was a humanitarian reason, not to say Mengele was dead. To have people looking for Nazis all these years was humanitarian, even though they're close with the Nazis. The fate of the fugitive is worse than a death sentence, they were quoted as saying. Well, if the fate of a fugitive is so bad, he's not a fugitive anymore when he's dead, so why protect him? Nothing about this makes sense. You're not being humanitarian to protect a dead man who was once a fugitive. You just say he's dead, but that doesn't make sense. It says the Bossarts kept his secret away and kept that because they feared revenge by the Israeli agents. So again, it's the Jews who are to blame. The Jews will get him, the Jews will come, the Jews will get us. The Jews would follow them, and then they'd find more Nazis because I'm sure their farms were safe houses for other Nazis, and so they weren't going to tell what happened, but they were a convenient source to pull the Mengele story if anybody really got hot on Joseph Mengele, and certainly with a $4 million reward of $3.5 million, there's a lot of people wanting Mengele, and there's a lot of poor people. A well-known plastic surgeon in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, said there are substantial differences between the photo files of the Auschwitz death camp doctor and those discovered in the possession of these people down there. A professor of plastic surgery was talking about the physical differences. Now, when I sent the letter to the White House and to these 90 members of the press, and then other letters to members of Congress on Fritz Kramer and the shenanigans going on with subterfuge of the 2 Kramers, who are they the same Kramer? I hadn't yet gotten information until a week later about a Mr. Fritz Kramer going to Europe to the Zurich accounts with meeting Mr. Felix Steinecker, Mengele's attorney over in Switzerland. I learned that after I got the letter out. But I did enclose in that letter a page from Paul Manning's book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. And I hope if the people that received that letter from me, some of them didn't throw it away, I hope that they would read it and pull it out today, because this is so appropriate to what was to follow that I don't know how, but I felt it was important to put it in that letter. Maybe some of you may ask yourself why at that time, but I sent this out April 22nd to these various people, and the news story about Joseph Mengele didn't break until June the 6th. And it's about the CIA trying to end the speculation that Martin Bormann is alive, and they held a press conference in Frankfurt to declare that Martin Bormann died in Berlin in 1945. This is a press conference that took place in 1972. A crew of ditch diggers unearthed two skeletons in Berlin and tried to locate. They realized that this was an area where they tried to locate Martin Bormann a while back, and they were 20 yards from the previous effort. And a military person, Mr. Stumpfegger, Stumpfegger, Hitler's physician, had left the bunker with Bormann in 1945, and they found two skulls in 1972, so they started to say that this was Martin Bormann and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. So Dr. Hugo Blasch, Blaschke, we've talked about him before, Blaschke, I guess in German you'd pronounce it. He met with the Frankfurt press. The Frankfurt German investigators, the ones working closely now with this Mengele story in Brazil. And they went into the dental records and tried to show various means by which they could say, absolutely, this was Martin Bormann. And you, Trevor Roper, he's from the London Times and British intelligence, high up in British intelligence, who had said that Hitler had died in the bunker, said in the New York Times, January 14th, 1973, I have my own reasons for thinking that Bormann may have escaped to Italy and then South America. Now, he was willing to bury Hitler, but he, even in that late date, 73, thought Bormann was alive, and Simon Wiesenthal is going around saying that Martin Bormann is dead. And the book, Bormann, Nazi in Exile by Paul Manning, it was published by Lyle Stewart in 1981, tells about Mr. Wiesenthal went to the heart of the matter unknowingly, and he saw the information in Frankfurt at that time and thought there was a slight difference in the skull structure. And then this book goes on to say that he went to the heart of the matter, for the alleged Bormann skull was that of a grisly stand-in, a substitute whose teeth and entire dental structure was carefully prepared over a period of time on an inmate in a concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. Let me pronounce it for you. Spell it S-A-C-H, S-A-C-H-S-E-N-H-A-U-S-E-N, Sachsenhausen, who looked almost like Martin Bormann, and not quite. So they substituted this body and the dental records of the man saying those were Martin Bormann's and tried to bring them together, and it didn't match, even though Wiesenthal still says Bormann is dead. Now, in this book, Paul Manning says, substituting one body for another has been a ploy, much used by General Heinrich Müller of the Gestapo. It was he who coordinated the details of Bormann's disappearance. This is according to statements made by separate individuals working for 3 different intelligence services. The Berlin skull is from a body placed in the location of a freight yard April 30th, 1945, by an SS Gestapo team commanded by General Müller. It was placed there at that time, that skull, and then it's dug up in 1972. That's how long the plans were, and it's very important to this Mengele story to show how long these plans are worked. It was put in there by the Waffen-SS. Their account, goes further into the book on the details on this. Another authority on Martin Bormann has said that Bormann planned his flight with extreme care as part of a grand design. He planned it, this quotation is from 1977. It was a scheme to lead future forensic and dental specialists astray. The London Daily Express termed the Frankfurt press conference by Willy Brandt's government a whitewash, and said they were forever trying to free Martin Bormann from harassment. When they announced that this was proof that he was dead, they accused him of trying to stop the search for Bormann. The European press according to these allegations, made a deal between representatives of Bormann's Nazi group in exile in South America and the government of the Federal Republic of Germany. The speculation was that by doing so, the government itself would be free from the unending nagging pressure of continuing to search for Martin Bormann. And as a result of the Frankfurt press conference, Bormann was, without worldwide trumpeting, officially declared dead. And once he was dead, Dr. Horace Goff, Gauff, the state prosecutor for Hesse, the area where it was taking place, removed from the West German warrant for Bormann's arrest and the reward of $36,000 for Bormann's capture. Now, if they could say that Joseph Mengele is dead, this would get Mr. Helmut Kohl and the Bonn-Bitburg government off the backs of people of trying to look for and explain Mr. Felix Steinecker, Mr. Fritz Kramer, the Institute for Historical Review, the Swiss bank accounts for Joseph Mengele. It would get this government and Ronald Reagan and DeLorean and Gordon Novell's network of the Permindex, the British-American-Canadian corporation that became titled Permindex. This stopping it would get the Bonn government not responsible anymore. The rewards could be taken off, and for all purposes, they would say he's officially dead, like they could declare Oswald officially killed John Kennedy or Sirhan officially killed Robert Kennedy, and that would be the end of the story. Now, interestingly enough, in December of '84, that's not too long ago, 6 months ago, Jack Anderson had a report of Joseph Mengele in his newsletter. Jack Anderson said, a report is circulating inside the CIA that Joseph Mengele, the famous Nazi, is dead. And I sent my associate to Paraguay last month to find out if the report was true. And he goes on to say something very interesting about the Mengele story. He said, underground sources told me that the CIA report on Joseph Mengele's death is premature and that it might even be deliberate disinformation intended to protect Mengele from Nazi hunters. Now, Jack Anderson gets reprints of my broadcast from Charles Spears, and he knows that I've been on this case of DeLorean, Klaus Barbie, and Joseph Mengele. So isn't it interesting that the CIA in December of '84, and I've been on this for 2 years, wanted to get the story of Mengele off their neck and end it by saying that he was dead, and he's traced the disinformation as being premature and coming from the Central Intelligence Agency. That would figure, right? Now, I've mentioned several times, or many times on the broadcast, that I do have contacts that have been working on the Mengele story and supplying me with information for a long time. One of them is Brian Boylan, Boylan, and he's written a book that I've had mentioned on the air, haven't done enough yet, called The Final Trace. And the other fellow goes by the name of Charles. He is having press conferences, and if his name is in the news, then he identifies himself, then I'll share it with you. I don't want to put it on the air without his permission. But I talked with both of them yesterday on this story. Charles said that the real key to this case, he thinks, is Pop Buell, Edgar Buell, whose name I found in Covert Action that was published 2 years ago, and his relationship to Hal Buell and Joseph Mengele and the accounts in Switzerland. And he told me to pursue the Buell story, and that also the same people that have kept up with the Mengele story in South America told him 2 weeks ago, which would be around May the 25th, that Mengele has 3 options when he was leaving after the death story, that he was dead. They didn't say that he was going to pull the death story, but he was planning May 25th to go. There was Europe, Canada, or the United States. And, of course, with all of this going on, if he's declared legally dead, then he can move to any one of these places and continue the lifestyle that he has. Of course, Charles and Brian don't believe for a minute that this is Joseph Mengele, and they have given to the Associated Press and NBC copies of the SS dental records, which they said in Germany they didn't have, but which these two men, and they have also body measurements and facts about Joseph Mengele and surgeries and details that Bonn wants to forget about and wants to say this is Joseph Mengele, but they can use, if they don't admit it isn't Mengele, then they'll go to more facts and information that they've had for years. In the book Aftermath by Ladislas Farago, He refers to Dr. Goebel's secretary, Wilfred von Oven, such a name. And I've told you before that Mr. von Oven was the source of contact to both Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele for Charles and Brian. And they told me about his name, and I was able to look it up in one book. They know about him and have talked to him. And if Mengele were alive, was dead rather, why are they in touch with him or talk with him? And why was he the man to go through in order to contact Mengele, who in fact did not die in 1979? We'll continue on that in one moment. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue on the Joseph Mengele story. This is Mae Brussell, in case you turned in at the beginning of the program or didn't get the name or not familiar with the program. The program is called World Watchers, and it's broadcast number 705, June the 10th, 1985, and this is the second half of a 1-hour broadcast. May the 20th, 1985, Newsweek had a quotation of the attorney that I think I had a part of smoking out with the help of Charles and Brian. Thanks to them over the years, this Felix Steinecker, and I had this on the air before May 20th, Joseph Mengele still has a lawyer, according to Newsweek, in Frankfurt named Fritz Steinecker, and recently the attorney went beyond a no comment, which evidently he's been asked before. Yes, I have represented Mengele, he said, and I still do represent him. End quote. Does that sound like a man's been dead since 1979? They want to get him off their back? That sounds a little outrageous. Now, just to cite again, and I've had it before, May 1981, there was the story in Life magazine, and it was done by a lot of people with careful detail, that Joseph Mengele was in Westchester County, Mount Cisco in New York, north of New York City. Now, this is important, the time period here, in 1979, because this person who was supposed to have died in 1979, on paper, died, and they could pull that out later thanks to the offices and the man who funds the Mengele operation in Germany. The date is important because he could have then left Brazil in 1979 and gone on up to Westchester County where he was seen, because officially he's going to be dead through these people that are operating now. And he could go on from there, even to Switzerland and into Canada, as stated before. They now believe he is in Canada. And this article came out in 1981, that in 1979 he was in upstate New York, and also see at that time period he would be dead in Brazil. But he went back to Paraguay many times, in Argentina and Brazil. If he was in New York in 79, he didn't stay there, but it was a place that he could visit easily and travel around ever since. I cited last week the story from Mr. Timmerman, and he's not a person who throws names around and says things lightly. He came out from Argentina, a former editor there, and then moved to Israel when the military dictatorship let him out of prison. And he said that Joseph Mengele was now based in Uruguay, 1981. So Mengele wasn't dead in 79, and I don't think Mr. Timmerman would have reason to lie. Now, one of the big keys to this story that I've cited before years ago on earlier broadcasts that I bring up again, it's very, very important. It was published June 22nd, 1979. Now, the stories of this burial were February 1979, this quick drowning and burial. Out of Rio de Janeiro, there was a very important thing that happened, and this is from the Washington Post. The Brazilian Supreme Court Wednesday denied extradition petitions that were filed by 4 nations to send Gustav France, F-R-A-N-Z, Wagner, W-A-G-N-E-R, back to Europe. Germany, Poland, Austria, and Israel had wanted him as a member of the SS who ran 2 concentration camps. One was Sobibor and the other was Treblinka. Now, while he ran Treblinka, SS Karl Wolff ran Treblinka with him and worked with William Donovan and Alan Dulles of the OSS simultaneously while he was running Treblinka with Wagner. That's how important Wagner is. And then SS Karl Wolff went down to Argentina where they had a quick burial there at the time that people were beginning to be aware of his presence and wanting him just a year and a half ago. Now, this article says the Austrian-born farm worker, and they were all farm workers, great farmers, now 68, this is in 1979, turned himself over to the San Paulo police in May of 78. Now, that's very important. It was May 1978 that he said, "Protect me." Now, these are the same police that are doing the autopsy now on this body that's going on in San Paulo, Brazil, okay? He goes to them and he says, "Protect me," because he and several fugitive Nazis attended a neo-Nazi congress held near here to celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler. That was in 1978, April of 78. Wagner's identity later was confirmed in a dramatic police-state confrontation, and he said that he was the man from Sober Bar that they wanted, as if they didn't know that. Now, April 1978, there was this birthday party, and this man was photographed there. He was photographed with another man who the headlines in Brazil in the newspapers had in Buenos Aires at the same time, and I'd love to go and get those early papers from the South American country of Brazil that stated that Adolf Hitler was alive and attended that birthday party. Adolf Hitler and Wagner and there were a whole large group of Nazis there that were identified, and Wagner got nervous and went to the police department for protection. The very police that knew about the birthday party of Hitler, that knew about the top Nazis, are in charge exclusively of that autopsy now. Now, he went to the police department for protection. Again, in the aftermath, Farago's book that's so filled with information, on page 262, he talks about John McCloy being worried about the resurgence of Nazis. He was the high commissioner in Germany who let all the top Nazis out, the bankers, and we don't have to run them all down now, but even quotes John McCloy's concern about Nazism. And in this book, he says that the London Times was having an Armistice Day cemetery, and when the wreath was being laid down by Queen Elizabeth, a man broke in the crowd yelling "Heil Hitler." That in the United States, in New Orleans, this is the home base of David Ferrie and Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister. In New Orleans, the police scooped out a Nazi stormtrooper club, complete with swastikas, photographs of Hitler, a cache of hidden arms, a program of violence, which is continuing and linked again to the Aryan nations, to Richard Butler, and the worldwide Nazi connections. And its founder announced at the time of his arrest, their leader, "I have information that the Fuhrer is alive in Argentina, and I'm going to join him there." This was on a worry about resurgence of Nazis, and it had to do with New Orleans and Nazis. Now, June 21st, 1971, there was another story from the Associated Press. Brazil won't extradite the accused Nazi. This came out, as I say, in 1979, and tells how he fled to Brazil in 1950, and he was living on a farm at Atibai, Atibai, and he was identified by a photograph taken in a birthday commemoration of the Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler that was held in Brazil. He turned himself in when he heard the police were looking for him. Some photographers came, and a couple of these men, allegedly Hitler, threw their hands over their face. They broke in some way and took pictures, and Wagner went to the police and said, "Help me." None of the countries wanted him, and they didn't want him because that birthday party, I believe, is a key to the law that happened afterwards. This was in 1979, April of 79. Another story, ex-Nazi officer commits suicide in 1980, a year later. Franz Wagner, who said he only obeyed orders at the Nazi camps, allegedly killed himself. He was in control of the police, and they put him in a mental hospital, in quotes, to protect him from his suicidal tendencies. But Mr. Wagner, an Austrian and former officer in Hitler's SS elite guard, took his own life. And again, it repeats that he was recognized. And here it says, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal identified him from a newspaper photograph taken at the birthday party for Hitler near Rio de Janeiro. Wagner turned himself in after the police wanted him. He turned himself in when the picture was taken. Wiesenthal wasn't the one behind this, or if he was, why didn't he go for everyone else in the picture? If Wiesenthal has the picture of that birthday party, then he has a picture of a man who could be Adolf Hitler, because that's when that famous picture was taken. Wagner turned himself in, and this was what was going on in Brazil, and this man dies in custody of the police who he went to for protection, and they are the people doing the autopsy on the Mengele body in the same city with the same people. And then the Wiesenthal Center sent out a bulletin in 1981 from their offices in Vienna saying that on October 4th, 1980, Wagner, who lived on a friend's farm, finally succeeded to end his own life by stabbing himself with a knife, so the case is closed on Wagner. Now, getting on to Mengele and some of the horrendous stories that have been in the news, and to untangle them if I can in this short time. Just to review, going up to June with about 5 items. 1, January 85, this year, the United States may investigate the Mengele case because they have information that he used another name and also was in Canada and had a Canadian visa and a pseudonym under a Menke rather was his pseudonym, and a visa from Buenos Aires under pseudonym in 1962. Now, this one family is saying that he lived with them until 1961, and there's evidence that he was in Canada at that time. Now, listen to the logic of this. A person working to find Nazi war criminals under, I guess, Rabbi Marvin Heyer, the dean of the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles studying Nazi war crimes, had a quotation, and they refer to Heyer and Wiesenthal Center, of a former inmate of Auschwitz who recalls his memory of Joseph Mengele. I just want to give you this quotation to show you the twisted logic of some of these people and what is going on if you have difficulty understanding it. This is a former inmate of Auschwitz, evidently, who was helping Wiesenthal and Dr. Rabbi Marvin Heyer on some of their work. He recalled, on the eve of his departure for Poland, for a commemoration this year of the 40th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. This is 1985. He remembers the Nazi doctor who was an enigmatic figure who protected his human guinea pigs and showed a bizarre interest in Jewish life. The former inmate from the concentration camp, his name is Mark Berkowitz. He's a furniture salesman from New York City. He said he and his 12-year-old twin sister were experimental subjects of Dr. Mengele, and that he suffered from spinal injections from Dr. Mengele. At the same time, Mr. Berkowitz said that the doctor wanted to keep us safe when they wanted to experiment on us. He said that the doctor, Dr. Mengele, liked Jewish mannerisms and attitudes and delighted in using certain Jewish expressions and affectionately nicknaming the youth for a Jewish sage. One day, he recalled, this is Mr. Berkowitz, just ready to go to Europe on the anniversary of freeing the concentration camps, he recalled that he was in a camp garden picking Brussels sprouts for Dr. Mengele's dinner. My Brussels sprouts, I think. Okay, I call the people who listen to World Watchers and do research and become lawyers and journalists and so forth, my Brussels sprouts that have discussion groups. He was picking Brussels sprouts for Dr. Mengele's dinner when he noticed a column of women marching through the dust to the gas chamber. Among them, he saw his own mother. Dr. Mengele saw this, and he gave me, this is Mr. Berkowitz, a message to carry so I could follow my mother to the gas chamber. He's growing Brussels sprouts for Joseph Mengele, and he gets a pass so he can walk his mother to the gas oven, and she's put in the oven. Then he comes back and works for Mengele, and he comes back to the United States and sells furniture in New York City. Can you imagine this kind of horrendous human story that comes out of tangling with these people and what we do for our lives? I don't know what he was supposed to do. Maybe he should have walked into the oven with his mother, but he is saying the sense of humor, the kindliness of Mengele. He softened his attitude, and he's growing his Brussels sprouts. Heaven help the planet Earth if there's more of this kind, and I know there are around. February the 10th. is another story from London Times. Joseph Mengele under military guard. He's been sighted in Paraguay and on the border near Brazil in the village of Volendam. I might have mentioned this before on the air. He's been seen at Laureles, further south along the Panara River. This is going on, London Times, 1985. It doesn't sound like Mengele is very dead. And President Stroessner, whose family comes from Bavaria village near Mengele's home, near Gunzburg, the town of Gunzburg, has said that Mengele hasn't been seen since 1949, but this article goes on that he's visible in areas of Paraguay that border Brazil and Argentina, and he makes trips to South America, and he travels. It said he's made travels with another former Nazi who lives in Guayra near Brazil, Guayra near Brazil, and he was last seen by a small number of the German Mennonites in an austere religious sect in the farms in the jungle. I had said that he would be found in the farms of the jungles of Brazil at the current time, not in Paraguay. That's what I told Ralph Blumenthal of the New York Times. Now, I did mention the links in Portugal, that he was in Portugal in 1980. Senator Alphonse de Amato has documents, along with Senator Arlen Specter, postcards from Portugal, Christmas cards from Joseph Mengele visiting in Portugal. Hardly dead in 1979. And February 20th, the Los Angeles Herald has a story. Dr. Mengele lived in Paraguay as a beekeeper, and it goes on to, this is the important story that hinges the looking for Mengele that escalated after all the time that I had spent for 2.5 years on the Mengele story. February the 20th was the hinge pin of a lot of this investigation, because a man who is a defendant in jail, Richardo Riefenstahl, spelled like the German photographer, Hitler's famous photographer, Riefenstahl. He's a German-born beekeeper, and he said that he shared Mengele's residence in Paraguay with Joseph Mengele down in Paraguay. He had told Rabbi Heyer from the Wiesenthal Center. And it was when he gave the evidence there that he also revealed the drug trafficking and the narcotics trafficking. And when he brought in the cocaine trafficking, Riefenstahl is in jail in Bonn for his involvement in cocaine trafficking, and he's been questioned about it. That was the link of the cocaine to the Klaus Barbie that I was talking about, that then forced the powers that be at the Wiesenthal Center and in Germany and in Frankfurt to have meetings for 2 months and to smoke out Mr. Fritz Steinecker. It was the arrest of Richardo Riefenstahl and is talking about Mengele and the narcotics connection that smoked this whole thing out to a head. Very important links that opened up this whole story. Now, briefly, just running down what has happened in the last few days, because the cocaine documents then were produced after Mr. Riefenstahl talked in February of 27th, the Los Angeles Times. Then had the story of the CIA admitting they had documents that Mengele was, in fact, in drug traffic. Then in May of 85, just 2 weeks ago, a West German and Luxembourg investigator went to an office of a Texas businesswoman, and they confiscated a photograph, supposedly of Mengele. She owns a water purification business that takes her around the world. I don't want to get into the John Hinckley family and their water wells, their plans for Guatemala, or Dr. Peter Byrne and is working with World Water and the United Nations now. I don't want to digress from Mengele, but this woman takes her activities to war criminal Joseph Mengele with a water purification project. And they ran into her office and got certain documents of hers in May 22nd. Now, another article coming out of the Washington Times. I have 3 stories of the Washington Times. You know, Mr. de Borschgrave has offered that huge $1 million reward, and I've talked about Reverend Moon and their interest in locating people who know where Mengele is because of Moon's money in Uruguay and in South America, and working with the people around Mengele, if not directly with him. They had a story May 22nd. Mr. Wiesenthal claimed Mengele was sighted in Paraguay in a settlement of Captain Miranda outside Hanoi, Honeneau. Hohenau, I guess it would be spelled Hohenau, as late as July 84. And Mr. Wiesenthal was going to ask West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to prepare to meet with General Alfredo Stroessner in July or as soon as possible this year. Now, this is May 22nd. In the Washington Times, Wiesenthal is forcing Helmut Kohl, and that is about the time that the West German government, I'm sure, was ready to pull out the records and try to push a dead Mengele, because the Bonn government now wants to end the case and end the running. And as the Israeli intelligence said, they don't want the publicity anymore. This was the time to end the war memories, and they could officially declare him dead. And Wiesenthal was asking Kohl, Helmut Bitburg Kohl, to meet with Stroessner. Now, Stroessner said, I'll come up and see you. He's from Bavaria. He is the dictator of Paraguay, the man who is housed and would know everything or as much as he needs to know about Joseph Mengele. Just this week, Stroessner canceled his visit to Germany. Richard von Weizsäcker, the president of Germany, didn't want to be seen shaking hands with him at this time. This was going on during the Bitburg exposés that Stroessner was coming. The Mengele story was heating up. They always had what they thought was a trump card. Stroessner has canceled his visit. Now, May 28th, Beat Clarksville went to Paraguay to have an audience and to run full-page ads to ask people to have a part of these millions of dollars reward. She was turned down, and she was told at that time, according to the Washington Times, that he was close to the Brazilian border. The people told her he was there. They didn't want money, but they told her he was there, and she was putting pressure on Mr. Stroessner, who was going to fly to Germany. Help me, help me. And Mr. Kohl says, we've done it, we've got a body, you don't have to come. Mengele's down here, everything's all right. And they were ready to pull what they did in Nazi Germany, hiding teeth and skeletons as early as 1945 that they could pull out in 1972 to prove that Bormann and Hitler's doctor were dead. Long plan to have these grave arrangements, and I do want to. I say I'm not going to have enough time to detail it piece by piece, but I'd be sure to believe I'll be doing it next week because I've spent a lot of time on it trying to make it clear for you. But this is May 28th, 1985. In the Washington Times again, another story. Hot lead surfaces on Mengele by the Justice Department. Our own Justice Department of the United States, Mr. Scher, is going to be reporting hot leads on Mengele. Now, as soon as they said they had a body there, he was seen on television running down to Brazil saying, we have a particular interest. The United States has an interest in this case. Well, you better believe they have an interest. If it involves Edgar Buell or John DeLorean or Edwin Meese with his contacts to the DeLorean case, or Gordon Novell and the Swiss banks and Mr. Fritz Steinecker, and then to the Hollywood connections to Johnny Carson and all the interweaving of the John DeLorean story and Klaus Barbie trial, you better believe the United States has an interest in this case. So there was an interview with Mr. Scher, and hot leads were surfacing, and they quoted the London Times that said he was living in Paraguay, dividing time between a jungle hotel and a heavily guarded log cabin. Mr. Scher, along with a representative of the U.S. Marshal Service, went to Frankfurt to meet with Germans and Israelis. Now, that was May 28th that they frantically went there, and, of course, I was sending out by April 22nd to Washington, D.C., to the White House. I never heard from them about Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and the fraud that has been perpetuated on the American people. So Mengele was reported with his nephew in New York in 1979. He was supposedly left Paraguay officially in 79, but goes back and forth. And the trace for Mengele then began frantically with the breaking into a home and then several admissions in Brazil. Yes, we housed them, and this is the way the story has developed. I'll take it in chronological order, as I say, this week and next week for you. June the 6th, 1985, San Francisco Examiner, and of course nationwide, Romeo, R-O-M-E-U, Tuma, T-U-M-A, the head of the federal police in Sao Paulo, is 90% that Joseph Mengele is buried there, that he died on a beach February the 2nd, 1979. He arrived in Brazil 1969 or 70 and is buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhardt. The next day, this is June the 7th, the San Jose Mercury Night Rider. It shows how they smashed into the grave and hand-picked the bones. Alas, poor Yorick. We were looking at Hamlet. They held the skull aloft. This is identical to what they did when they exhumed the alleged Martin Bormann skull and the doctor's skull. They held them in the air. Here's the skull, so therefore it is Mengele. Very logical. And they said that the name that he had used when he lived in Brazil was Mr. Gerhard, Wolfgang Gerhard, but that Mr. Gerhard had died in Paris in 1977. He gave his identity card to Joseph Mengele, and then he went to Paris and he died. Of course, a discrepancy comes up later because the San Jose Mercury also prints that one story was that he had drowned and was found, the real Gerhard had actually been killed in 1977 in Paris and in a car accident, and then another story that he died in Austria 6 months before Mengele's name had surfaced using his name. So that in 1968 he was supposed to have had a car accident in Austria. That's version 1. And version 2, according to the San Jose Mercury, one was the LA Times about the car accident in Austria, and then the San Jose Mercury had that he died in Paris in 1977. So he had 2 deaths. You can have your choice, Austria or Paris. The first story, as I say, that he died in Paris and that he gave his identity card to the Bossarts, to a man who actually was Joseph Mengele, and that was altered to match Mengele, and that he had returned back to Austria, and that the chief prosecutor, Hans Hauelsen, Hauelsen, said that the story of Mengele started to break when the police were called in Germany, and they called then the authorities in Brazil, and they told them that somebody in Germany had a friend down in Günzburg, Germany, Mengele's hometown, had a friend down in Brazil who had letters and addresses and phone numbers of a family named Bossart living in Brazil. The German authorities called Brazil and said they located a man who had these names. Now, the man they located is the very man who was the courier for the money going down to Joseph Mengele, Hans Sedlmeyer, Sedlmeir. He was the manager of Mengele's tractor factory, and he worked for Dieter Mengele and his other nephew who ran the factory. He provided the names of the families who would give the pictures and proof that Mengele lived in Brazil. Now, how cute is that? That the man who was managing and disseminating this money, Mr. Hans Sedlmeyer, would tell the German police to call Brazil and go to these 2 homes, and there you would find the people where Mengele stayed. That Gitta Stammer was one of those people whose family name and address were in the books, and this is where the Telltale Diary is to be located, and the handwriting and the pictures. Now, nothing would be better than for them to find Mengele officially dead, particularly with the heat that's coming on now. I don't think they ever thought it would develop like this. So Hans Sedlmeyer, the manager of the Mengele tractor firm, the tractor factory in Günzburg, Germany, told the police in Germany to go to Brazil and take these 2 homes, and there you will find where Mengele stayed. Now, why would he be turning in his friend Mengele? He's sending money to him. He's delivering $400,000 at a time down there to Joseph Mengele. So why at this time is he saying, go down there? And the police go there, and there's pictures and letters and diaries, and yes, there's a certificate, and yes, this man drowned in 79, and, oh yes, we buried him. We went swimming with him, and he happened to drown, and Mr. Bossart happened to be swimming with him when his head went under. And the best friend and the employee of the Mengele factory, not an outsider, is telling you where to find the home and the Telltale Diary, and that's how the story broke. And the family in Germany, in Brazil rather, who gave him the safe house, housed him there. Now, sure, there's handwritten notes. There's a book on genetics. There's a picture of the man. Why not? His son Rolf went down there in 1977, 2 years before he allegedly had died, but he might have been living at the safe house. But he didn't live with these people. They gave him a home away from them on an alleged farm, so he didn't pay any rent and he gave away a lot of money. And then his son allegedly comes down to take back the belongings when he's dead, the diary, the pictures, and all the clothes and items. Well, if he went down to collect them, why would they be there now? Why would there be a trace of him, except they need it later? Now, seeing a photograph of Joseph Mengele, having fingerprints of him down there, doesn't mean he's dead. You can have a diary he wrote, you can have a book on genetics, you can have his favorite Mozart record. Sure, he stayed in those safe houses from time to time, and the one safe house he might have stayed there, this 1979 picture period when Wagner and Hitler and other top Nazis, and I don't want to confuse the Hitler issue, but that date and that event has been clear for me and for some of you, I've been talking about for a long time. Now, the day of the burial of Mr. Gerhardt, the cemetery administrator wanted to open the casket, but he didn't succeed. They said, you can't see what's in the casket. It had no autopsy. It was buried without an autopsy, and they weren't able to open the casket. Those are two reports from the San Francisco Examiner and the San Jose Mercury, the first two. The Ralph Blumenthal in the New York Times, June the 7th, has a story how this fast-moving development appeared to catch the Special Investigation Unit unawares, despite assertions of close cooperation with West Germany, and the documents came from the home of Hans Sadelmeyer, who I mentioned, a former factory manager for the Mengele family in Gunsberg. Mr. Scherer and the United States government were caught completely by surprise. The Mengele employee and the family decided to use this time bomb, such as that burial of Martin Bormann, the same kind of fraud. I'm running out of time now. I'll get back with this story next week to discuss the techniques by which they tried to pull this off. This is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California. You take care, and we'll continue on this subject.